walk that shook the NBA. Victor Wembanyama did not lose the finals quietly. He lost them in a way the entire NBA may remember for years. The final buzzer had barely stopped echoing inside San Antonio when the cameras caught the image that instantly swallowed the whole series. The Knicks were celebrating. New York players were flooding the floor. A championship drought that had lasted more than half a century was finally over. But while the basketball world expected the usual handshake line, one of the biggest stars on the planet turned his back and walked straight toward the tunnel. No embrace, no congratulations, no final look at the team that had just taken everything from him. Just Victor Wembanyama, the 7'4" face of the Spurs' future, disappearing into the locker room while the Knicks celebrated on his home floor. And that image changed everything, because this was not just a young player upset after a painful loss. This was not just frustration. This was the player many people had already crowned as the next face of the NBA, walking away from one of the oldest traditions in playoff basketball. In one moment, the conversation shifted from New York's championship to Wembanyama's maturity, leadership, and future in San Antonio. Fans exploded online. Some called it emotion, others called it disrespect. Some said he was only 22 years old and had just carried an entire franchise to the final. Others said that is exactly why he needed to stand there, look the Knicks in the eye, and accept the loss like a leader. That is what made the moment so powerful. It was not only about a handshake, it was about pressure. It was about pride. It was about what happens when a generational talent meets a level of pain he has never felt before. And the truth is, this walk-off did not come out of nowhere. It was the final scene in a postseason filled with warning signs. The emotional reactions, the physical frustration, the media controversy, the late-game mistakes, and the growing belief that the NBA may be protecting its brightest young star a little too carefully. Wembanyama had historic numbers. He gave Spurs fans hope they had not felt in years. He proved he could dominate at a level few players his age have ever touched. But the finals also revealed something uncomfortable. Greatness is not only about highlights, blocks, threes, and impossible stat lines. Greatness is also about composure when the arena turns against you, humility when you lose, and leadership when your emotions are screaming at you to run. So now the question is bigger than one game. Did Victor Wembanyama simply have a human reaction after the most painful loss of his young career? Or did the NBA just get its first real warning that its next superstar still has a long way to go before he can truly carry the crown? Because San Antonio did not just lose a championship series. They lost control of the story. And when your franchise player becomes the story for walking away instead of standing tall, the offseason suddenly becomes much more complicated. Before we go deeper, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you think Wembanyama deserves understanding, comment 1. If you think he should have stayed and shaken hands, comment 2. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only getting started. Why one handshake became bigger than the game? The reason this moment exploded is simple. In the NBA playoffs, respect matters almost as much as winning. Every generation has its own unwritten rules. You compete hard, you talk, you fight through pressure, you try to break the other team's spirit for 48 minutes. But when the series ends, especially on the final stage, you acknowledge the battle. You shake hands, you look across the floor and recognize that the other side earned it. That is why Wembanyama's walk-off hit so hard. For some fans, it looked like a young superstar refusing to give credit to the team that beat him. For others, it looked like a broken player trying to escape the most painful moment of his career. And that split is exactly what turned one walk into a national argument. Because if this had been a bench player, the story would have died in a few hours. But this was Victor Wembanyama. This was the player the league has marketed as something close to basketball science fiction. The player with the body of a center, the skills of a guard, and the expectations of a future global icon. When that kind of player makes that kind of decision, it does not stay small. Draymond Green's reaction only poured fuel on the fire. His message was blunt. When someone beats you, you look them in the face. You do not run from the pain. You do not let the opponent know they got to you. You stand there, absorb it, and remember it. That is the part many former players understood immediately. The handshake is not really for the winner, it is for the loser. It is a test of pride. It shows whether a star can handle being humbled in public without losing control of the moment. And Wembanyama failed that test in front of millions. But the story is not that simple. He had just watched the Knicks celebrate a title on his floor. He had carried San Antonio through a season nobody expected to end in June. He had made mistakes, absorbed criticism, dealt with pressure, and watched a dream collapse one possession at a time. At 22 years old, that is a heavy emotional storm. Still, sympathy does not erase responsibility. The face of a franchise does not only represent himself, he represents the locker room, the city, the fan base, and the culture around him. That is why the walk mattered. It made people wonder whether Wembanyama is already great enough to dominate the league, but not yet mature enough to lead it. And that question is now following him into the offseason. The alien everyone wanted to believe in. Before the criticism, before the walk-off, before the finals collapse, Victor Wembanyama was the dream every NBA franchise wanted. He was not introduced to the basketball world like a normal prospect. He arrived like a warning. Scouts had seen tall players before, they had seen shot blockers before, they had seen international phenoms before, but they had never seen someone this tall move with that kind of balance, touch, timing, and imagination. That is why people called him the alien. It was not just a nickname, it was a statement. Wembanyama looked like he came from a different version of basketball, a future version where the old rules no longer applied. He could block a shot at the rim, recover to the three-point line, dribble into a jumper, and make defenders look like they were guessing at a language they did not understand. San Antonio knew exactly what it had when it drafted him first overall. This was not just another rebuild. This was a franchise reset. After years of waiting for the next era, Spurs fans finally had a reason to believe the old magic might be coming back, and Wembanyama embraced that hope. He did not play like a young player trying to survive. He played like someone who understood he was being measured against history. The blocks became viral clips. The deep threes became nightly conversations. The stat lines became ridiculous. Every week, it felt like he was doing something the league had never seen before. That is what made the finals controversy so complicated. Because this was not a player who had failed. In many ways, he had over-delivered. He took the Spurs from promise to pressure faster than anyone expected. He made San Antonio relevant again. He gave the city a reason to dream about banners, not lottery odds. But when you become that important that fast, the standards change. People stop judging you like a young player. They start judging you like a superstar. Every reaction becomes evidence. Every mistake becomes a debate. Every emotional moment becomes a question about leadership. That is the burden Wembanyama walked into. He was celebrated as the future before he had fully learned how to survive the present. And once the playoffs arrived, the league stopped treating him like a miracle and started testing him like a man expected to carry everything. That is where the real story begins. How San Antonio started believing again? For years, San Antonio felt like a city waiting for its basketball heartbeat to return. The Spurs had history. They had banners. They had memories of Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker, Greg Popovich, and a culture that once felt impossible to shake. But history does not win games by itself. And for a long time, Spurs fans were stuck watching the past feel larger than the present. Then Wembanyama changed the air. Suddenly, every regular season game felt like an event. Every arena wanted to see him. Every national broadcast wanted a piece of the story. San Antonio was no longer treated like a quiet rebuilding team. They became one of the league's most watched experiments. What happens when a generational young player lands in one of basketball's most respected organizations? The answer came faster than expected. The Spurs started winning, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with enough force to make people pay attention. Wembanyama was protecting the rim like a one-man defense, stretching the floor like a wing, and creating matchup problems no scouting report could fully solve. Opposing coaches could plan for him, but planning and stopping are not the same thing. By the time San Antonio pushed into playoff position, the city was alive again. Fans were not just cheering, they were remembering. They remembered what it felt like to expect something meaningful. They remembered what it felt like when the Spurs were feared, and Wembanyama became the center of that emotional revival. That made the finals run feel bigger than basketball. This was not supposed to happen so quickly. A young team is supposed to lose early, learn slowly, and build step by step. But San Antonio skipped stages. Wembanyama's brilliance pulled the timeline forward. Suddenly, the future was not years away. It was standing under the bright lights in June. And that is where the danger started, because when a team arrives ahead of schedule, it can confuse promise with readiness. The Spurs had the talent to build leads, shock opponents, and control long stretches of games. But championship basketball asks a harsher question: can you finish when everything tightened? In the finals, San Antonio found out the answer was not yet. Wembanyama gave the Spurs belief. He gave them identity. He gave them a reason to think the dynasty dream could return. But belief alone does not close games, and identity alone does not survive pressure. The Knicks would expose that truth in the most painful way possible. The first crack in the image. Long before the handshake controversy, there was another moment that changed the way people talked about Wembanyama. It happened in the playoffs. When the physicality rose, the whistles got tighter, and every possession started feeling personal. Minnesota had a clear plan: make his life uncomfortable, bump him early, crowd his space, fight him on catches, put bodies on him, force the young superstar to prove he could stay calm while the game got ugly. For a while, He tried. But playoff pressure does not just test skill, it tests patience. And in one heated sequence under the basket, Wembanyama's frustration finally broke through. The contact was heavy. The battle for position was rough. Then came the swing of the elbow, the whistle, the ejection, and suddenly the story was no longer about his dominance. It was about control. That moment mattered because it gave critics their first real opening. Until then, most conversations about Wembanyama were filled with awe. After that, the tone changed. People began asking whether he was too emotional, whether opponents had discovered a way to get inside his head, whether the league's next great superstar could be knocked off balance by playoff physicality. Then came the NBA's decision. No major additional punishment, no dramatic suspension, no heavy financial consequence. San Antonio exhaled, but the rest of the league started asking questions. Would another player have received the same treatment? Was the NBA protecting its brightest young attraction? Were the rules being applied evenly? Or was superstar value quietly shaping discipline? That is when the controversy grew beyond Wembanyama himself. Because fans can forgive a young player for losing his cool once. What they do not forgive easily is the feeling that the league is handling stars with softer gloves. Once that idea enters the conversation, every later mistake gets connected back to it. That is exactly what happened. The elbow became part of a pattern. The media situation became part of a pattern. The handshake became the final piece. People used to argue that Wembanyama was being allowed to learn painful lessons without paying the same price others might pay. Fair or not, that perception matters. And for Wembanyama, the toughest part is that perception can become reality in the public mind. A player can be brilliant, hardworking, and sincere, but if the audience starts believing he is protected, every mistake becomes proof. That was the first crack in the image. And once it opened, the finals made it impossible to ignore. When the league started choosing sides, by the time the finals arrived, everyone already had an opinion about Victor Wembanyama. Some saw a once-in-a-generation player being forced to grow up too fast. Others saw a superstar receiving superstar treatment before earning the full responsibility that comes with it. And as the noise got louder, the NBA world split into two camps. One side defended him. They argued that people were forgetting his age. He was 22, carrying a historic franchise, playing deep into June, dealing with constant double teams, physical pressure, media attention, and impossible expectations. They said emotional mistakes do not erase greatness. They said every legend has painful learning moments before becoming complete. That argument has weight. Michael Jordan had to lose before he became unbeatable. LeBron James had to endure public failure before he mastered the burden of expectation. Even Tim Duncan, the quiet model of Spurs leadership, needed the right environment and the right lessons to become the standard everyone now points to. But the other side had a point too. They argued that leadership is not something you postpone until it becomes easy. If Wembanyama wants the crown, he has to accept the criticism that comes with it. If the league wants to market him as the future, then he can not only be judged by highlights, he has to be judged by the hard moments too. That is where the discussion became uncomfortable. Because Wembanyama was both things at once. He was a young player learning in real time, and he was already the center of a franchise's championship hopes. He was still developing emotionally, but the basketball world had already placed him on a throne. That is a dangerous combination. The media controversy made it worse. When other players had been punished for skipping availability, fans remembered. When Wembanyama appeared to avoid a harsher penalty, fans noticed maybe the league had its reason. Maybe the situation was not exactly the same. But in sports, perception often moves faster than explanation, and the perception was clear. The NBA needed Wembanyama on the floor, needed his story alive, needed his presence in the biggest games. That made every later mistake feel magnified. So when he finally walked away from the handshake line, people did not see one emotional decision. They saw the latest example in a growing argument about maturity, accountability, and star protection. That is why the reaction was so intense. Wembanyama was no longer just playing against opponents. He was playing against the image the league had built around him. The finals collapse nobody saw coming. The strangest part of the Spurs finals loss is that they did not look overmatched. For long stretches, San Antonio looked like the better team. They had size. They had energy. They had Wembanyama bending the geometry of the court. They built leads again and again, forcing New York to chase, adjust, and survive. On paper, that should have been the formula for a championship. But the finals are not won on paper. They are won in the final 6 minutes, when legs get heavy, play calls get tighter, and every mistake feels twice as loud. That is where the Knicks were stronger. Not more talented, necessarily, not more spectacular, just calmer, sharper, and more connected when the game demanded discipline. San Antonio could build a lead, New York could steal them up. That became the series. The Spurs would control the middle of games, then suddenly possessions would slow down. The ball would stick. Wembanyama would drift toward jumpers. Teammates would hesitate. Defensive rotations would arrive half a second late, and the Knicks, sensing panic, would attack with the confidence of a team that believed the pressure belonged to the other side. Game after game, the pattern repeated. The most painful collapse came when San Antonio blew a massive lead and watched New York steal the game at the end. That was not just a bad loss. That was the kind of loss that changes a locker room. Players remember those. Coaches remember those. Fans remember exactly where they were when the lead disappeared. And for Wembanyama, it became part of the larger question. How can someone so dominant for 3 quarters become so uncertain when the game turns into a chess match? How can a player who looks unstoppable in space suddenly seem rushed in the clutch? How can the same superstar who gives you the lead also struggle to close the door? The answer is experience. Closing in the finals is a different sport. It is not enough to be taller, more skilled, or more talented. You have to recognize the moment before it swallows you. You have to know when to attack, when to pass, when to breathe, and when to demand the ball without forcing the game. Wembanyama is learning that, but the finals do not wait for young stars to learn comfortably. They punish every lesson in public. And by the time the Knicks finished the job, San Antonio had not just lost a series. They had exposed the exact gap between Wembanyama's talent and Wembanyama's championship maturity. That gap is now the entire offseason. The burden of being too great too soon. Victor Wembanyama's biggest problem may be that he became great before he became complete. That sounds strange, but it is real. Most young stars get years to fail quietly. They miss the playoffs, they lose in the first round, they make mistakes in games, fewer people are watching, they learn how to handle pressure before the whole world expects them to dominate it. Wembanyama did not get that luxury. He became must-see television almost immediately. Then he became the reason San Antonio believed. Then he became the player opponent's game plan for every night. Then he became the face of a finals run before most players his age even understand what playoff basketball truly demands. That kind of rise creates a problem. The public starts treating potential like a finished product. Fans see the blocks, the threes, the impossible stat lines, and assume everything else should arrive at the same speed. Leadership, emotional control, late game decision making, media composure, locker room command. But those parts of greatness do not grow overnight. They are built through pain, and the finals gave Wembanyama plenty of it. The missed shots, the turnovers, the blown leads, the feeling of watching New York stay calm while San Antonio tightened up, the frustration of knowing he was the most gifted player on the floor, yet still unable to bend the ending the way he wanted. That is the kind of pain that can either harden a player or haunt him. The concerning signs were obvious. At times, Wembanyama looked exhausted. At times, he looked rushed. At times, he seemed caught between taking over and trusting teammates. That is a difficult balance for any superstar, especially one still learning what kind of leader he wants to become. Carmelo Anthony's point makes sense here. Great players eventually have to decide when the game belongs to them. But that does not mean forcing every shot. It means understanding rhythm. It means controlling emotion. It means knowing when your teammates need confidence and when they need you to end the possession yourself. That is where Wembanyama still has room to grow. His talent is not in question. His future is not in question. But his next step is not another highlight. It is control. Control of the game. Control of the moment. Control of himself when everything around him is burning. The handshake controversy was loud, but the deeper lesson is quieter. The NBA has seen Wembanyama's gifts. Now it needs to see his growth. The Tim Duncan shadow. In San Antonio, greatness has a name that still hangs over everything. Tim Duncan. That is the shadow Victor Wembanyama cannot avoid. Not because fans expect him to become Duncan exactly, but because Duncan represents the standard. He was not loud, he was not dramatic, he did not need viral moments to prove control. He carried the Spurs with discipline, humility, consistency, and an almost impossible calm. That is why the comparison matters now. Wembanyama has gifts Duncan never had. He can stretch the floor in ways Duncan did not. He can move like a wing, protect the rim like a center, and create highlights that look unreal. But Duncan had something Wembanyama is still building: emotional economy. He knew how to save his energy for winning. He knew how to absorb frustration without letting it become the story. That is the lesson San Antonio needs Wembanyama to learn. Not to become less passionate, not to stop caring, not to turn into a silent machine. The passion is part of what makes him special, but passion has to be trained. Fire can power a team, or it can burn holes in the structure. This offseason, the Spurs' mission is bigger than adding talent. Yes, they need more shooting. They need another reliable creator. They need players who can handle pressure late in games, so Wembanyama does not have to carry every possession like a mountain on his back. They need a roster that makes his life easier, not just more exciting. But they also need mentorship. Wembanyama needs voices around him that can tell him the truth without attacking him. He needs veterans who understand June basketball. He needs coaches who can challenge him. He needs people who can say, "You are good enough to dominate the league, but you are not above the details that make champions." That is what separates stars from foundation. San Antonio has the rarest basketball piece in the world. Now they have to build the right environment around him. If they do, this finals loss could become the painful origin story of something powerful. If they do not, the pressure could keep arriving faster than the maturity needed to handle it. The Spurs cannot waste this lesson. Wembanyama has already shown the league what he can be physically. The next version has to show what he can be mentally, because the road back to the finals will not be easier. Opponents have seen the cracks now, and every contender will try to press on them. The lesson behind the loss. The truth about Victor Wembanyama's first finals heartbreak is that both sides can be right. The critics are right to say he should have stayed on the floor. He should have shaken hands. He should have looked the Knicks in the eye, accepted the loss, and let the pain become fuel without letting the moment become a controversy. That is part of leadership. That is part of being the face of a franchise. But his defenders are also right. One bad walk does not erase an incredible season. One emotional decision does not destroy a career. One painful finals ending does not change the fact that Wembanyama carried San Antonio to a place the franchise had been chasing for years. He is still rare. He is still brilliant. He is still one of the most terrifying young players the league has ever seen. The real lesson is not that Wembanyama failed. The real lesson is that greatness has stages. First, the league notices your talent. Then it studies your habits. Then it attacks your weaknesses. Then it watches how you respond when the dream breaks in public. That is where Wembanyama is now. He has to turn frustration into discipline. He has to turn criticism into maturity. He has to turn the image of himself walking into that tunnel into something he never wants to repeat. Not because the internet demanded it, not because the media embarrassed him, but because leaders do not run from pain. They learn how to stand inside it. For the Spurs, the strategy is clear. Build a stronger closing lineup, add players who can calm the game down, give Wembanyama help that fits his timeline. Surround him with toughness, shooting, and veteran wisdom. And most importantly, protect the culture. Do not protect him from accountability, because accountability is exactly what will make him stronger. For Wembanyama, the advice is simple but difficult. Stay hungry, stay humble, and make the next handshake mean something. Call the legends. Learn from Duncan. Listen to the people who have won before. Do not let pride steal lessons that pain is trying to teach, because one day, he may stand on the other side of this moment. One day, the confetti may fall for San Antonio. One day, Wembanyama may be the one holding the trophy while another young star has to decide whether to stay or walk away. And if this loss truly changed him, he will understand exactly what that moment means. So this was not the end of Victor Wembanyama's story. It was the first real scar. And sometimes, the scar is what turns talent into legacy. If you believe Wembanyama will come back stronger, comment 1. If you think the Spurs need major changes around him, comment 2. Subscribe for more NBA stories, share this video with another basketball fan, and hit like if you want more deep breakdowns like this.